What is the role of religion in our ever-changing world? From the News Channel 5 Network, this is Issues of Faith.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Issues of Faith. Glad you are with us. We're going to have a good discussion today. There's no doubt these are difficult and trying times. We now are in the midst of a pandemic, of racial division, of a divisive election, and economic struggles for many. And so I wanted to invite on somebody who could give us a biblical perspective on where we are. And I'm very happy that a renowned biblical scholar is joining us. Dr. Amy Jill Levine, professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies at Vanderbilt University, joins us via Zoom. Dr. Levine, thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
I know you've been on before, and you talked about a book that you had written about the parables. And it's short stories by Jesus, the enigmatic parables of a controversial rabbi. And the parables are so powerful. And I wanted to ask you, as we are in this time that is so difficult for so many, what from the parables do you think we can learn? If we were to read some of those parables, you know, what kind of do you think would stand out we should maybe focus on?
Right. Well, when reading the parables, don't give up what you already believe. If you think they're about Christ and they're about salvation and they're about God's love, hang on to all of that. All of that is really good. But what we can do, and here we meaning historians or people interested in the first century, interested in what Jesus' audience might have originally gotten from those parables before the church got a hold of them and gave it all their various interpretations over the past 2,000 years. What would a bunch of Jews by the Sea of Galilee make of these stories? And when we do the history, we find out that not only did it speak to them in their own social situation, with Rome in the background, with questions of famine, with issues of poverty, with issues of do we go to war or are we going to stay peaceful? But they speak to our circumstances today. For example, there's a lovely parable, if parables can be called lovely, because generally they shake us up. In Matthew chapter 20, which is usually called the parable of the laborers in the vineyard, where people work for a different number of hours, some in the heat of the broiling sun from 6 o'clock in the morning, and some coming on, at 5 o'clock when closing down is at 6. And they all get paid the same amount. And the ones who were there from the beginning begin to grumble, as one would, you made us equal to them. This isn't fair. And the Lord of the vineyard, who normally is understood to be God, says, listen, I can do whatever I want. And this is usually understood to be about salvation. It doesn't matter when you convert, it matters that you convert. That's fine. But let's think of this in terms of first century labor economics. This landowner is a very peculiar landowner because anybody who knows how to run a business knows how many people are needed to work in that field or needed to service that factory. He goes out at 6 and at 9 and at noon and at 3 and at 5. So clearly either he's totally mismanaged or something else is going on. So let's think about this from a first century perspective. They're all there together out there at 6 o'clock in the morning, all these day laborers looking for work. And when the landowner says, well, okay, you 3 come and everybody else stays here, why didn't the 3 say, wait a minute, it's a big field. Can't we bring my friends here along to help? And that way they would also get the usual daily wage. That would have saved them work and it would have given them their friends dinner that night. But they don't say anything. And at 9 o'clock, the same thing happens. And the people who were passed over at 6 know what it's like to be passed over. But do they advocate for their friends? Not at all. And the same thing at noon. It's like kids on the playground when you're choosing up teams. You know what it's like to be left behind. But do you advocate for your friends? No, you're just happy to be chosen. If these people had advocated right from the beginning, the work would have been much easier because it would have been shared. Everybody would have been the same amount. The workers would have been in solidarity and the landowner would have been looked at as generous. But instead, the workers are set against each other. Maybe the parable tells us something about advocating for our friends. Maybe the parable tells us something about how everybody needs food at the end of the day. The parables very often depend upon the Old Testament or the Tanakh, the Jewish scriptures. And we're told that when King David was dividing up what he earned, the people who stayed with the bags got as much as the warriors because they all needed something. That's part of the Jewish tradition, and that's part of what the parable is trying to teach us. So it could all be about salvation, that's fine. But maybe it's advocating for your friends if you have a job and they don't. Maybe somehow they could come along and there might be enough at the end of the day to feed everybody.
Pay attention to others is the gist there, right? Pay attention to our neighbors. We are not in this alone. And I think that's an important message.
If the neighbors come along, right, if the neighbors come along, then they help us. So we benefit too.
There's another.
It's a win-win.
Yeah, a win-win. There's another parable that you talk about. This was a book, as I said. It came out a couple of years ago, several years ago, but it's been also put into a study guide that churches can use. And I saw session 1, which looked at 3 parables: the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son. That last one's the one many people know, the parable of the lost son, that last parable. The prodigal son. Tell us about that. How we can look at that differently, and how those 3 together can maybe inform how we look at things.
Right. So normally the parable of the prodigal son, we're in Luke chapter 15 here, is understood to be the prodigal is the sinner who's afraid to come to God the Father, but it turns out God the Father actually loves the sinner and welcomes him back. And it's all about the Father's love. And the older brother, who drops out of most of the sermons, which is why it's called the prodigal son rather than the guy with 2 sons, is looked at as the Jews or the Pharisees who are grumbling because God is generous. And that's just an anti-Jewish and false reading. So we can do better. The parable of the prodigal son is the third of 3. So we have the lost sheep and we have the lost coin. And then it turns out we actually have 2 lost sons. And the first one begins, which person among you, having 100 sheep, upon losing one? So at this point, the sheep owner, who's never called a shepherd, has lost the sheep. It's his own fault. He lost the sheep. And when he realizes he's lost the sheep, it's an all-out search. It's fine. And then he throws a party. And what we missed here, because we're not thinking like first century sheep owners, is if you have 100 sheep and you've lost one, how do you know? Because all sheep look alike, and you can't say to sheep, line up in groups of 10, because sheep can't count. And you can't say, oh, it's the one with the beret or the one with the Vanderbilt sweatshirt, because sheep don't accessorize. So the only way you know is you pass them through something called a sheepfold, and you count them, right? So he counted, and he noticed one was lost, and then he has to search for that lost one. That's all important. The next parable is called the parable of the lost coin. Or what woman, having 10 silver coins, upon losing one, so it's her own fault, doesn't light the lamp and sweep the house until she finds it? And she calls up all of her girlfriends, which is great because the Greek is in the feminine. This is a woman with independent means and her own friends. And she says, rejoice with me because my coin which was lost is found. This is not about repenting and forgiving. Sheep don't repent, and the sheep owner lost the sheep. Coins don't repent, and the woman lost the coin. It's about figuring out that you've lost something. If you have 10 coins and you've lost one, how do you know? Because you count them up. We've gone from 1 out of 100 to 1 out of 10. And the next parable begins, there was a man who had 2 sons. This is 50% here. And we begin to think that maybe it's the younger son, the prodigal, who takes his inheritance and goes off and spends it in a somewhat silly manner. He doesn't sin, but he's not terribly wise. He blows all his money. He's afraid to come back home. And finally he says, yeah, I'll go to dad and sound religious, as my former colleague David Buttrick once described this parable. And God welcomes him back. But the kicker line, because Jesus is just such a fantastic storyteller, is the older brother is outside in the field, and he hears the sound of music and dancing, and he calls a slave to ask what was going on. And the slave says, oh, your brother just came back safe and sound, and dad killed the fatted calf. And the older brother became angry and refused to go in because there was a father who had 2 sons and he forgot to count. He had enough time to call the band and the caterer, but it didn't occur to him till that his son was in the field. So what does this tell us? You can pick up a sheep and you can pick up a coin, but it's very, very difficult to pick up a disaffected child who has been doing the right thing all those years and has been ignored. So the parable tells us, make everybody feel counted. Don't leave out the person who's done the right thing all the time. Make them feel counted as well. So I thought, after I had written the book and studied this, I thought I had it, right? And the thing with parables, once you think you got them, somebody comes up with a new reading and then you have to go regroup. So I've been teaching at Riverbend Maximum Security Prison for a number of years. And when I brought my reading of the parable out to Riverbend, my insider students looked at me and they said, AJ, we're counted several times a day, which is not what I had been thinking. And then I thought, that's right. So when you count people, it's not just counting heads. It's making sure that people feel counted, feel recognized, even the ones who we are so likely to overlook because they're always there doing the right thing. Today, we would call those folks essential workers. Make sure they feel counted, they are recognized, and they get the fatted calf at the end of the day.
I love that. Essential workers. That's absolutely right. And who is it in our lives that we are overlooking? There's so many different ways to look at that parable, and you can look at it from the perspective of the father, of the young son, and of that son that was out in the field. But this is kind of a new take for me, and I really do appreciate it. And you gave one other example that I liked as a teacher. You said, as a teacher, you quickly learn the brightest, kids in the class, and maybe you learn the ones that are going to struggle. But what about that one kind of in the middle who's working hard and getting everything done? Maybe that's somebody that gets overlooked sometimes, right?
The B-plus student who sits in the third row off to the left in the back. You're part of this class too, and I need to make you feel just as welcome and just as important, and just as invited to come talk to me as anybody else would. The other thing with that parable, there's so much. We can read through either brother or we can read through the dad. I want to read through the slave. So when the older brother says to the father, when the father finally comes out, the older brother says, look, all these years I've been working like a slave for you. Well, the slave standing over there on the side is thinking, no, you have not. Let's take slavery seriously. And that's another place where the parables can lead us, because there are lots of parables about slaves. Let's pay attention to them.
So who do we leave out? Who do we not count? That's something to think about, that parable kind of brings to mind. We're going to take a break, and then I want to come back and talk about your latest book, which is about the Sermon on the Mount, a beginner's guide to the kingdom of heaven. And again, I think this is just valuable to talk about as we're in this time. So we'll take a break. Be back right after this.